Was the Black Prince really dead? Could a king be felled by a simple sneeze? And what if a 9-year-old boy born on a feast day meant to herald divine favor, inherited a kingdom riddled with debt, rebellion, and a suspiciously fragrant mistress? Let's dive into the chaotic, glittering, and utterly baffling reign of Richard II, a story that reads like a Tudor soap opera dipped in medieval armor. The year is 1377. The air in London is thick with the scent of wood smoke, spices, and something vaguely unsettling, a blend of ambition and desperation. A 9-year-old boy, Richard of Bordeaux, is crowned king. Not a battle-hardened warrior like his grandfather, Edward III, nor a shrewd politician like his father, John of Gaunt. Just a boy elevated to the throne by circumstance and a healthy dose of Plantagenet tradition. But beneath the velvet robes and the carefully choreographed ceremony, a storm was brewing, a storm of debts, conspiracies, and a very, very complicated succession. Let's rewind because the story of Richard's rise is inextricably linked to the downfall of his father, the legendary Black Prince. Edward, Prince of Wales, a name that conjured images of ruthless efficiency and battlefield glory, had spent years locked in a brutal war with France. Najera 1362, a resounding English victory, but at a terrifying cost. The campaign had drained the Principality of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory, dry. The coffers were empty, the soldiers were sick, and the whispers of discontent were growing louder. Then came the dysentery, a silent, insidious enemy that swept through the returning army, claiming the lives of many, including the Black Prince himself. But the financial woes weren't simply a matter of extravagant court life, though, let's be honest, there was a lot of silk and jewels. The export of wine from Aquitaine, once a lucrative source of revenue, had plummeted. The transition from a war economy to a peacetime one was a messy, painful process. And then there was the matter of Pedro, John of Gaunt's, the Black Prince's brother, inability to reimburse the prince for the Najera campaign. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a slow, grinding financial catastrophe. Imagine trying to run a kingdom on a shoestring, while simultaneously battling a powerful enemy and dealing with a truly appalling case of bad timing. Meanwhile, across the border in Gascony, the people were simmering. The collection of a hearth tax, the fouage, was the spark that ignited the powder keg. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control. The English administration, staffed largely by English appointees, was seen as alien and oppressive. The French, who had long considered Aquitaine their own, resented the English presence and the imposition of English laws. The revolt of 1368 wasn't a Gascon rebellion, it was an Aquitanian uprising, a desperate attempt to reclaim their independence. And the Duke of Anjou, Charles V's ambitious brother, was skillfully fanning the flames, offering support to the rebels and subtly undermining Edward's authority. Edward, weakened by illness and increasingly isolated, responded with brutal force. The siege and sack of Limoges in September 1370 is a stain on his reputation that refuses to fade. The details are gruesome, the numbers disputed: 300, 3,000. It wasn't a strategic victory, it was a display of power, a desperate attempt to assert control, and it backfired spectacularly. The revolt spread like wildfire, with 900 towns and castles declaring their allegiance to the rebels. Edward's commanders, overwhelmed and demoralized, watched as the Rouergue, Quercy, and the Agenais fell to the French. It wasn't a failure of administration, though the administration was a disaster, it was a fundamental breakdown of authority. Edward was simply too ill, too distracted to effectively lead. His military prowess, so admired in his father's time, was now eclipsed by a debilitating sickness. Back in England, the situation was equally precarious. The war with France had resumed, fueled by Charles V's relentless ambition and the English inability to reinforce Aquitaine. The English fleet was defeated off La Rochelle in 1372, effectively ending any hope of a naval victory. Edward, desperate to regain the initiative, launched one last, doomed expedition to France in August 1372, only to be thwarted by unfavorable winds. He returned to England, defeated and disillusioned. But the problems weren't confined to the battlefield. At home, the kingdom was teetering on the brink of financial collapse. The wool trade, once the lifeblood of the English economy, was struggling. Parliament, increasingly suspicious of the king's advisors, demanded subsidies and scrutinized every expenditure. The justices of the peace, newly created to enforce the law, were repeatedly dismissed for corruption, only to be reinstated and then dismissed again. The king's chancellor, treasurer, and keeper of the Privy Seal were all ousted, victims of a chaotic and unstable government. The Good Parliament of 1376, a gathering of powerful nobles and influential clergy, refused to grant the king any direct taxes, demanding instead an extension of the wool subsidy. And then there was Alice Perrers. Let's be clear, this woman was a force of nature. A Lombard merchant's widow, she quickly captivated the aging Edward III with her beauty, her wit, and, according to many contemporary accounts, her blatant ambition. She became the king's mistress, and with that came a flood of grants, wardships, and jewels. She was a central figure in a network of London merchant capitalists who profited immensely from the war effort. William Langlands, the medieval poet, captured the public's outrage in Piers Plowman, creating the unforgettable character of Lady Mead, a personification of venality and greed. The attack on Alice at the Good Parliament was a carefully orchestrated political maneuver. Sir Peter de la Mare, the Speaker of the Commons, launched a scathing indictment of the king's closest associates, William Latimer, John Neville, and Richard Lyon, accusing them of profiteering and corruption. Alice herself was banished and her lands seized. But Edward, weakened by illness and increasingly reliant on Alice's counsel, quickly reversed his decision, restoring her to favor. The story of Alice Perrers is a microcosm of the larger problems plaguing the kingdom: corruption, instability, and a king increasingly out of his depth. As Edward's health deteriorated, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. The Plantagenet line stretching back to John and Henry III seemed secure, but the boy king, Richard II, was just 10 years old. His elder brother, Edward of Angoulême, had died in 1371, leaving him as the sole heir. But the prospect of a 9-year-old boy ruling England was deeply unsettling to many nobles. John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, was the obvious choice, a powerful and experienced nobleman, but there was also the possibility that Richard might be succeeded by one of his uncles, perhaps John of Gaunt himself. And then, a more distant, almost unbelievable prospect. The succession might pass through the line of Edward III's deceased second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, whose daughter Philippa married Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. Edward III, recognizing the potential for chaos, issued a series of carefully worded decrees, limiting the succession to the male line. It was a pragmatic, if somewhat unsettling, decision designed to ensure the stability of the monarchy. The details of these decrees were only recently uncovered in a badly damaged draft, but they reveal the extent of Edward's anxieties and the complexity of the succession crisis. The resumption of the war with France in 1369, following Charles V's ascent to the French throne, only compounded the problems. Charles V, a ruthless and ambitious ruler, skillfully manipulated the diplomatic landscape, securing the allegiance of Navarre, Flanders, Brittany, and Castile, effectively isolating Edward III and the English cause. The defeat of the English fleet off La Rochelle in 1372 shattered any remaining English naval dominance. With Aquitaine overrun and the king unable to mount a successful counteroffensive, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Yet, even in his final years, Edward III clung to the hope of a military victory. His last attempt to break the stalemate, a disastrous expedition to France in August 1372, ended in failure, thwarted by unfavorable winds. The great warrior king, reduced to a shadow of his former self, watched as his kingdom crumbled around him. As Edward's health continued to decline, the focus shifted to the succession. The coronation of Richard II in July 1377 was a lavish spectacle, designed to project an image of regal authority. But beneath the surface, the seeds of future conflict were already sown. The new king's advisors, led by John of Gaunt, were determined to assert the royal prerogative, while the powerful nobles remained wary of his authority. The final years of Edward III's life were marked by illness, paranoia, and a growing sense of disillusionment. The royal physician, John de Glaston, spent months tending to the king's failing health, administering remedies and preparing for the inevitable. In June 1377, Edward was transported to Kennington, where his father, the Black Prince, had died. He died on June 21, 1377, at the age of 51, leaving behind a kingdom teetering on the brink of disaster. His magnificent tomb in Westminster Abbey, completed in 1386, stands as a testament to his reign, a celebration of his achievements and a declaration of his dynasty's enduring legacy. But even in death, Edward III's story remains a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of power, the dangers of ambition, and the unpredictable nature of fate. So, what happens now? A 9-year-old boy burdened with the weight of a kingdom inherits a legacy of debt, rebellion, and a suspiciously fragrant mistress. Can he navigate the treacherous currents of politics and warfare, or will England descend into chaos and civil war? The answer, as always, remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the story of Richard II is a story of ambition, betrayal, and the enduring struggle for power, a story that continues to fascinate and intrigue us centuries later. And finally, the question remains: was the Black Prince truly dead, or merely lost to the relentless tide of disease and circumstance?